The kid had somehow managed to endure the first 2 days of the journey, before hunger and the deafening noise of the engines had finally forced her up out of her hiding place, where she'd been discovered by one of the ship's engineers. Despite repeated demands as to how she'd managed to get aboard the vessel, she'd remained stubbornly silent. In light of this, there'd been little alternative other than to bring the matter to the attention of the commanding officer. Captain Hampshire had only been assigned as the ship's master at the outbreak of hostilities 12 months before. At first, the crew of the Bickley Bridge had found him abrasive in their dealings with him, verging on hostile at times. But it had soon become clear to the men that he was both a fair and knowledgeable sailor, who genuinely seemed to have their best interests at heart, and he had quickly gone on to earn their respect. Malcolm Hampshire sat now, thoughtfully puffing away on his pipe, and cast a weary eye over the dishevelled teenager that had been deposited before him in the ship's galley. It soon became clear that the poor girl was terrified beyond belief, her apprehensions most likely influenced by a throng of leering sailors who stood regarding her from the room's entryway. When the captain had mused to himself out loud that additional duties could always be found for idle hands, this group had promptly disappeared. With her audience now reduced down to the ship's senior officers, the stowaway's nerves had seemed to ease a little. In the end, the offer of a hot meal and a glass of whiskey from the doctor's medicinal supply turned out to be the final incentives needed to coax an account from her. Hampshire and his fellow officers listened on with interest, as their unexpected passenger explained that her name was Jessica. 3 days prior to this, she had been driven from her home by the actions of a cruel and abusive father. Cold and alone, young Jessica had wandered the streets of Halifax until her travels had brought her to the docks. Seeking shelter and some form of escape from her situation, the girl moved amongst the various berths as she searched for a way onto one of the waiting vessels. The unattended walkway she'd eventually come across had led her up into the Bickley Bridge and her current predicament. For a few minutes after her account was complete, the captain sat in silence, taking the occasional drag on his pipe before he rose from his chair. Hampshire informed his passenger that he had not been much older than her when he had first set foot on a ship. If she was prepared to work for her passage, he would help facilitate the new life she was seeking. The teenager could barely hide her delight at the offer, promising Hampshire her complete and utter loyalty, before promptly tucking into the meal that had been laid down before her. In the interim, it was decided she would be assigned to Doc Wynne as his assistant, the ship's medical officer tasked with protecting the youth from any unwanted attention from the crew, as well as introducing her to the basic rules of maritime life. The young medical officer accepted his new role with a warm smile, explaining he had grown up in a household with 3 sisters and was confident he could handle whatever issues the girl had brought with her. Having made his way back to the bridge, Hampshire settled down into his seat and drafted a circular for the crew, in which he detailed the circumstances surrounding the enlistment of their new medical assistant. This task completed, he then leafed through the records of the day's radio transmissions, before rising to his feet to check their bearing in relation to the ships they were travelling alongside. Convoy HX-84 would still be within range of Allied air cover for a further 3 days, before it was finally forced to enter what had become known amongst the merchant sailors as the Black Pit. And whilst the presence of the American fighter bombers was no guarantee of safety from enemy attack, the risk of their ship being sunk by a marauding U-boat was considerably reduced now. What neither Hampshire or his fellow officers could have known at the time was that a German battlecruiser was already steaming directly towards them, having slipped through the Allied defences patrolling the European mainland. And yet, whilst this enemy vessel would be responsible for countless deaths in the coming hours, a far greater threat was already lurking, much closer by than any of them could hope to know. The first portent of the approaching danger occurred on the morning of the 5th day, when Seaman Spencer failed to report for his watch duty. This was not uncommon amongst the longer-serving members of the crew, but Spencer had still been relatively young in service and keen to impress. The ship's first mate, a cheerful Southern Wales native named Owen Thomas, was naturally perturbed by the absence. At his behest, Spencer's bunkmate was sent for, explaining he had not seen the missing crewman for at least a day. With this revelation, the Welsh officer's concerns increased, with parties dispatched to search every compartment and passageway of the tanker. But try as they might, the crew could find no trace of the missing sailor. Further interviews were conducted with the crew, which gradually revealed that Spencer had been involved in an ongoing feud with one of the ship's oilers, an Irishman named Guthrie. Suspecting foul play may be at hand, Thomas sent word down to the engine room for Guthrie to attend the galley, only to be informed the sailor in question had also failed to report for duties that morning. The search for the absent crewmen produced no clue to their fate, save for the discovery of a number of fresh blood spots located in one of the ship's upper bulkheads. No other sailors were sporting any recent injuries, and so it was hypothesised the missing pair must have come to blows during the night, and both ended up going overboard. With no witnesses to their plight, and no means of attracting the attention of their crewmates, the fate of the two seamen would quickly have been sailed by such foolhardy misadventure. While speculation about the strengths and weaknesses of this theory naturally began to circulate amongst the crew, it soon became clear that no other explanation was forthcoming. An uneasy air settled on the ship, the men going about their duties in sullen silence, more than one commenting it was the presence of a female aboard that had predictably brought them bad luck. The situation was not helped by the subsequent discovery of the aforementioned stowaway in the main crew quarters a day later, apparently rummaging through the personal effects of the two dead sailors. The swift intervention of Mr. Thomas prevented the girl from coming to harm, and she was again brought before the captain for questioning. Under his unforgiving gaze, Jessica denied any wrongdoing or intent to steal, but could not justify her actions. Hampshire's decision was that the girl was to remain confined to the infirmary for the next 2 days, and she was made fully aware that further poor behaviour would result in her being returned home following the return leg of their journey. Once the youth had left the cabin, Thomas updated the captain regarding the general disposition of the men. With the boundary of the Black Pit approaching, it was a situation that was far from ideal, both men resolving to keep the crew as occupied as possible in order to avoid any further incident. Amongst the first orders of Hampshire's tenure had been the conversion of one of the ship's storage lockers into a gym and recreation room. This sizable room had been decked out with a weights bench, dartboard, ping-pong table and a small library. It was here, on the 7th day of the voyage, the body of the ship's electrician was found by a pair of crewmen who had stopped by for a quick game of table tennis between shifts. As he awaited the arrival of Doc Wynne, Owen Thomas conducted a brief examination of the man's body. In his right hand, the dead sailor clasped a blood-soaked screwdriver, the apparent cause of death being a series of vicious-looking wounds in his stomach. Nearby, lying on the metal deck, lay a discarded bottle of rum. Thomas then stood back as Luke Wynne, accompanied by his timid assistant, arrived to examine the body. The physician worked quickly, gently poking and prodding away at the wounds, before using a pocket torch to examine the corpse's facial features in close detail. The examination over, Wynne turned to the first mate, informing him that all the indications were the wounds were self-inflicted, the hapless sailor apparently having killed himself whilst blind drunk. Despite efforts to restrict knowledge of the incident, it took no time for the gruesome nature of the electrician's passing to travel the length of the ship. A funeral was swiftly arranged, Hampshire sharing a passage for the Bible, before the dead sailor was lowered over the side of the ship. As the assembled crewmen stood in silent contemplation, Thomas noted that Jessica had once slipped away from the doctor's side, at some point during the service. Acting on a hunch, he made his way directly to the crew quarters, where the Welshman found his quarry frantically hauling out chests and kit bags belonging to the ship's sailors. Feeling a rage growing inside him, the officer angrily grabbed the stowaway by the arm, preparing to discipline her, only to pause when he saw the hopeless fear etched across her young features. Having replaced the kit bags, Thomas led Jessica up to the ship's stern, where he sat her down on the deck, demanding to know what was taking place. The words elicited no response, with the girl sat staring down at the metal plating, refusing to meet his gaze. After a brief silence, he again appealed to her, more gently this time, telling her he believed that she knew more about the missing crew than she was letting on, and his only desire was to avoid any further loss of life. Jessica looked up, her gaze meeting his, and in his eyes she saw the officer was telling the truth. With a heavy heart, and as the sun began to slip down below the horizon, she admitted she had lied about the circumstances that had brought them together. For the first occasion during her time aboard the tanker, Jessica told the truth, about how her father was no monster, the reasons she had come to be aboard, and the great danger they were all now in. The previous afternoon, A civilian ship had been observed overhauling HX-84 on the starboard side. As it had laboured past, Captain Edward Fagan had signalled the vessel from the bridge of HMS Jervis Bay, asking it to identify itself and offering opportunity to join the safety of the convoy. The vessel had replied she was the SS Mopan, a medium-sized cargo carrier, and had politely declined the invitation. Now, several miles east of the approaching convoy, Captain Sapsworth and the rest of his crew stood, witnessing the slow death of their ship. They had been making good time, when like some ghostly apparition, a German heavy cruiser had materialised out of the day's dying light. Identifying itself as the Admiral Scheer, the battleship had ordered Sapsworth and his men to abandon ship, or face the consequences. Despite repeated pleas from his radio operators, Sapsworth had refused to transmit a distress signal, fearing to do so would result in his ship being shelled before he and the crew could evacuate. Now he took satisfaction the vessel was frustrating the best efforts of his captors to sink it. Despite multiple hits from the German guns, the Mopan remained stubbornly afloat, as the sun sank lower to the horizon with every passing minute. Up on the bridge of the Scheer, Captain Theodore Kranke tried to avoid the questioning looks of his crew. Rather than breaking away from the captured vessel to engage the approaching column of ships, he had instead insisted that his gun crew sink it. Now, night was rapidly approaching, reducing his ability to track and engage targets in the coming battle. But even without this inconvenience, Kranke was far from comfortable with his mission. As the Scheer had slipped out of Wilhelmshaven, his parting orders had been to engage the enemy wherever possible, but not to risk any harm coming to his ship. The oppositional nature of such orders was not wasted on the German commander, who suspected he would not be able to achieve one goal without disregarding the other. A cheer from below confirmed the wounded cargo ship had finally succumbed to the shelling, and orders were given for the captured British crew to be herded below deck. Kranke demanded to know the distance of the approaching column from his radar operators before issuing orders for the cruiser to move on. Even with the hindrance of darkness, the presence of so many Allied ships presented an opportunity he could little afford to pass up on. Thomas listened on as the tearful youth explained that her father had been a detective in the Halifax Police Department. He was a loving and caring man, idolised by Jessica and her two sisters, who would ambush him at the end of every working day, demanding to know if he'd captured any criminals. In recent weeks, he'd been part of a team of detectives attempting to catch a killer who had been murdering prostitutes down by the city's docks. Then, one evening, she'd been awoken by the sounds of muffled screaming coming from her parents' room. As she had recognised a voice that she heard as her mother's, the noise had suddenly been cut short, to be followed by the sound of footsteps on the landing outside. Terrified, Jessica had slipped from her bed across to her wardrobe, silently closing the door behind her. There was a sudden shriek from the room next door where her sisters slept, before this desperate cry was also cut short, followed by the sound of her own door opening. Holding her breath, she had listened as someone briefly moved around the bedroom, before the door closed and the footsteps retreated downstairs. Ever so quietly, the girl had then slipped out of her bedroom into the hall to discover she was the sole survivor of a massacre. Both of her sisters lay dead in their beds, throats open from ear to ear. In her parents' bedroom, she found her mother on the floor, nightdress stained crimson red by the wicked injuries that had been inflicted upon her. Lying on the bed, her father stared out at the ceiling through glassy and dead eyes, a gaping hole carved in his chest that oozed blood out onto the bedclothes. There were still sounds of movement downstairs as the girl slipped back into her bedroom, changing from a nightdress into daytime clothing, before clambering out of her window into the safety of the tall tree that reached up alongside it. As she crouched within the protection of the thick branches, the team watched on as a dark figure emerged from the front door of their address, before casually walking off out into their neighbourhood. Realising there was nothing that could be done to help her family, Jessica had gathered a few items before letting herself down from the tree and following the figure in the hope she could identify an address to guide the police to. For the next hour, she tracked the killer through the streets of Halifax, memorising his clothing and the distinctive briefcase he carried in his right hand. Eventually, she lost the man in a maze of barrels and packing crates down at the docks, only to espy him once again boarding the Bickley Bridge a short distance away. Without a care for her own safety, Jessica had made her way up onto the ship in pursuit, only to realise at the last moment it was about to depart. Concealing herself in the engine room, She'd resolved to identify the killer and then alert the ship's captain as soon as she could. The first mate listened to the account in complete shock. On one hand, the fact there had been no new arrivals amongst the crew for the last year made him doubt the girl's story. But on the other, the deaths of 3 of his crew since the start of the journey indicated something was very wrong. Looking down at the fear in the girl's eyes, he made his decision, taking her by the hand and heading back down to the crew quarters. For the next 20 minutes, the pair inspected every luggage chest, footlocker and duffel bag, but there was nothing resembling the briefcase that Jessica described. As the girl sank down into a bunk, her head in her hands, Thomas placed a comforting hand around her. It was still possible the bag could be concealed elsewhere in the ship. They would search the officers' quarters and the infirmary before seeking further advice from Captain Hampshire. Jessica rose to her feet, hugging the officer as tight as she could. Wiping tears from her face with a sleeve, she thanked him for his kindness and then followed him out into the corridor to continue the search. As the pair disappeared from sight, a lone figure stepped out of the shadows behind them, before turning and making its way off in the opposite direction. Thomas followed the girl into the infirmary, securing the hatchway behind them, before joining her in searching every nook and cranny of the room. He hadn't been searching long, when his hands brushed across something hidden underneath the doctor's bunk, pushed flat against the wall there. With grim inevitability, he pulled the item out from its hiding place, his heart sinking as he discovered it was indeed a brown leather briefcase. With a trembling hand, he'd reached to open the bag, only for a piercing cry to interrupt him. Spinning round, he saw Jessica falling backwards to the floor, screaming out in horror. The door to the doctor's refrigerator was open, and the girl's eyes were fixed on the interior of the container. Crouching down alongside her, Thomas followed her gaze and saw 3 glass jars inside the appliance, filled with the dark and crimson fluid. Having seated the terrified youth down on her bunk, he returned to the refrigerator, lifting out one of the jars for closer inspection. Floating inside, preserved in some kind of fluid, were what appeared to be human organs. The first mate slammed the fridge door shut again, before grabbing hold of the girl and hurrying back to the officers' quarters. Once there, he located his service pistol and hastily began to load it. Suddenly, there were a series of explosions, clearly audible above the ship's engines. For a moment, there was a pause, before the emergency alarm began to blare loudly throughout every compartment and corridor in the vessel. Thomas rushed to the nearest porthole to see a salvo of shells rain down from above, landing directly in the centre of the column of packed merchant ships. He had expected immediate orders from the captain, or a situational update to come across the intercom, but there was nothing. More worryingly still, as he watched the other ships around them begin to scatter and flee, Thomas realised the Bickley Bridge was continuing, on a steady and straight course directly into danger. His head spinning, the Welshman slipped the last bullet into the revolver before grabbing Jessica and hurrying for the bridge. When the sailors on watch aboard the Jervis Bay had reported an unknown ship had been sighted on the horizon, steadily approaching the head of the convoy, Captain Fagan had initially thought little of the news. After all, there had been no briefings or radio traffic to suggest the Germans had managed to set a surface raider loose in the Atlantic. But when the vessel had failed to respond to signals, he became concerned. Moments later, the newcomer had turned side on to the approaching column of ships, and a volley of 6 shells had come screaming out of the night, straddling a nearby ore carrier. The captain had immediately ordered the convoy to scatter, before transmitting a desperate appeal for help and ordering his ship to engage the enemy. As the Jervis Bay had laboured on towards her opponent, it had become increasingly clear the British escort was hopelessly outgunned. Regardless, Fagan knew the convoy's only real hope was for him and his men to hold off the attacker long enough for the others to escape. With the ship surging forwards, the captain ordered his men to lay down a smokescreen and open fire with their 6-inch guns. On the bridge of the Sheer, Captain Cranker smiled to himself as he watched the approaching vessel. The Allied convoy's sole guardian was no match for the firepower his crews possessed. But the German commander's elation disappeared moments later, when a stray shell from the British craft impacted against the cruiser's radar tower above him. Cranker angrily ordered the enemy's ship be sunk immediately, harshly reminding his gunnery officers of their poor performance only hours before. His words had the desired effect, and within minutes, 11-inch shells were hammering down upon the Jervis Bay. The hopeless vessel violently heeled to one side, consumed by sheets of roaring flame before quickly slipping down beneath the waves. But there was little time for celebration. Cranker ordered the sheer forwards into the midst of the fleeing vessels, demanding an update on the damage to his ship's detection systems. The reply was that their radar was completely unserviceable, meaning targets could only be targeted using visual means. Cursing loudly, the captain snatched up a pair of binoculars in search of his next victim. Amongst the ships that now scattered ahead of the oncoming German battleship was the British cargo ship SS Beaverford. Her captain, Hugh Pettigrew, watched on in horror as first one, then another vessel was blown to pieces alongside them. But as his ship had started to spin away from the attacker, he had suddenly caught sight of the Bickley Bridge. The tanker had not deviated from her set course and was continuing sedately onwards directly into the sights of the enemy cruiser. Bewildered by this conduct, Pettigrew yelled at his radio operator, ordering the man try and raise Captain Hampshire. There was no reply, and as the third merchant ship was felled by fire from the sheer, the captain of the Beaverford realised what needed to be done. Pettigrew calmly ordered the helmsman to cancel the turn, and instead to engage the enemy. For the briefest of moments, the bridge remained quiet, each and every crewman remembering the speed and savagery with which the Jervis Bay had met her end. But then the men began to hurry to their posts, with a quiet and unquestioning loyalty that filled their commander with pride. As the Beaverford powered through the dissipating smokescreen laid down by the convoy's fallen escort, her crew began to drop their own smoke floats, whilst on the bow, her gunners readied their solitary 3-inch gun. Having sent a brief radio message to the fleeing ships wishing them luck, Pettigrew barked a series of orders to his crew, determined to frustrate their opponent for as long as possible. Aboard the sheer, Cranker was still staring in complete disbelief at the tanker that continued to sail directly towards his ship, as if her crew had not a care in the world. There was no way they could be blind to the fate that awaited them, but still they came towards it. He was on the verge of ordering the gunners to engage this unexpected gift when there was a sudden cry of alarm. A dark shape emerged from the billowing smoke not far from where the tanker was sailing. Without warning, it fired upon the sheer 3 times before turning sharply and re-entering the safety of the smokescreen. As the last shell landed harmlessly off to the sheer's starboard side, Cranker demanded to know the identity of the attacker, only to be told the swirling smoke had hidden it from the spotters. Thomas could tell the enemy fire was coming more quickly now, creeping perilously closer to his ship as it did so. He swore loudly, before remembering the girl was right behind him, and hurrying onwards towards the bridge. The Bickley Bridge had still not altered its course or speed, and yet the captain must know what was taking place around them. Moments later, he discovered why. The command deck was a charnel house, with every member of the crew there lying dead, at or near their post. Some were slumped over their controls, whilst others lay sprawled out on the floor, but all were covered in deep lacerations or wounds. Thomas stared in incomprehension at the lack of damage to the ship's instruments. They had clearly not been hit by enemy fire, so what had killed the men who had been operating them? Something caught his eye off to one side. As he turned, he brought the pistol up, only to lower it again as he saw Hampshire, staggering forwards whilst clutching a bloodied wound to his chest. Thomas pocketed the revolver, catching the wounded officer before he fell. The captain's breath was ragged, his voice weak and raspy, and he struggled to speak as he was cradled in the arms of the first mate. Hampshire was clearly trying to say something important, but his words were now lost to the sounds of mocking laughter coming from nearby. The Welshman looked up to see Doc Wynne, standing on the other side of the bridge with a predatory look on his face. In one hand, the doctor held a short sword with a square hilt, reminiscent of those carried by a Roman warrior. In the other, he clutched what seemed to be a piece of dripping and bloodied meat. The first mate's right hand slowly dropped down to the gun concealed in his pocket, as he tried to shift the stricken captain's weight to one side. But the movement was noticed by the doctor, who immediately lunged forwards. At the same time as Thomas dropped Hampshire to the deck, he drew the gun, but Wynne was already upon him. The two struggled frantically, Thomas discharging 2 rounds into the doctor's chest, before Wynne's sword stabbed down savagely into his right shoulder. A wave of pain lanced through Thomas's body, forcing him to release his grip on the revolver, in an attempt to staunch the blood that now flowed from the deep shoulder wound he had sustained. Grinning in triumph, Wynne rose to his feet, and then walked with cold deliberation towards the stricken captain. As Thomas watched on in horror, Hampshire weakly raised a hand to protect himself, before the blade was plunged down deep into his heart. In one movement, Wynne stabbed down again into the dead man's chest, carving a wide hole. He reached into it, twisting and tearing a dark mass of red and pulpy flesh free, before biting down hard on it. As he did so, the doctor's entire body seemed to shiver uncontrollably, before he rose back up to his feet. He turned to find the wounded Thomas again pointing the gun at him, but barely seemed to register the 2 further bullets the Welshman then fired into him. On board the cruiser, Cranker now found himself paralysed with indecision. Whatever the ship from the convoy was that had now engaged him, it was frustrating his gunners, continually slipping in and out of the smokescreen, firing a few shells before retreating once again. And whilst he had little doubt the attacker lacked the ability to cause any significant damage to his vessel, the fact his radar was already compromised was causing him to consider a retreat. But to return to Germany with only 5 ships sunk, none of which bore any great significance, would offer little incentive for his masters to authorise any future forays out into the Atlantic. Commanding the gun crews to ignore the British tanker, which was still inexplicably continuing to make its way toward them, he ordered the sheer to come about and focus its efforts entirely on the other ship. As it emerged once more from the safety of the smokescreen, Pettigrew now found the enemy cruiser sat waiting in expectation. Seconds later, the Beaverford's deck was subjected to repeated hits from the German guns. The fires caused by these impacts soon spread along the lengths of timber that was stored upon her decks, eventually igniting the ammunition sat in the cargo holds below. The resultant explosion inevitably tore the hopeless ship apart, immediately killing every man aboard her. Thomas lowered the gun in horror as the captain's murderer wiped the bloodstains from round his mouth and then cleaned the blade on the sword of one of his trouser legs. Resting the weapon against the nearby console, Wynne addressed the wounded officer, much as a teacher might scold a child, calmly and deliberately informing him that the bullets from the revolver were of little consequence. The Welshman listened on in increasing disbelief as the young doctor explained that he had once been named Lucius and had fought in Caesar's army during the conquest of the same German lands from where their current enemy originated. Mortally wounded by barbarians during an ambush in the Teutoburg forest, he had found himself lying alone and trapped below the body of one of his attackers, slowly bleeding to death. In desperation, he had begun to feast upon the warrior's corpse above him, finding that after he had done so, a great strength now flowed through his veins. Having freed himself, he had looked on in awe as his wounds had healed, and in time realised that any injury inflicted upon him by an opponent could be undone by a regular consumption of human flesh and organs. As the Roman Empire had gone on to wane around him, Lucius had gained great power and influence, outlasting both his allies and enemies alike. Centuries had passed, but through regular murder and feasting on victims, the former centurion found he did not age a day. Eventually, tiring of riches and luxury, he had set off around the world, visiting aging kingdoms as well as youthful nations. He had made his home amongst both princes and paupers, influencing the murderous actions of Elizabeth Bathory, as well as the reign of terror caused by the infamous Bean clan in western Scotland. The dawn of this century had found the Roman haunting the streets of Whitechapel, until the local constabulary had driven him from his favourite pastime, stalking and murdering the local prostitutes. From there, he had fled to America, travelling the southern states and murdering local families with their own farming tools, before the evolution of a national police force again forced him to flee. A brief return to Germany after the Great War had made him realise how easy it was to kill and murder undetected in the aftermath of the conflict. And so, for a time, he had continued his work with impunity, until the meticulous nature of the new Nazi government had forced him to move on yet again. But it was now, out at sea, he had finally found the freedom he desired. Arriving in new locations, he was able to murder and feast, before being transported away from the scene of the crime. In the periods between stops, he would feed on hapless sailors, his role as a surgeon easily diagnosing their deaths as the result of accident or illness. And now, the imminent destruction of this vessel allowed him a brief and heavenly period of true unrestraint, prior to escape to a new ship and the recommencement of his grisly pastime. Out of nowhere, the entire command deck was suddenly violently shaken from side to side, knocking the doctor from his feet. He sprang up quickly, fixing his eyes on the stricken Welshman with an evil stare. Fate had arrived, with the Shear's guns now having found their range, and it was time to end this business and make good his escape. In desperation, Thomas fired his last 2 remaining rounds, both hitting Wynne's right leg. With a grunt, the doctor slowly sank down to one knee, and as he went to stand up again, he suddenly found his right arm immobilised. He stared down in disbelief at the pair of metal bracelets that were now locked onto his wrist, securing it to the floor grating. Jessica stood a short distance away in triumph, her father's police handcuffs now sealing the fate of his killer. Wynne roared in anger, tugging and heaving on the limb, but unable to free it. He reached out for his sword, only to find it now in the girl's grasp. She began to advance on him with purpose, the blade unsteady in her hand until stopped by Thomas. Realising the urgency of their situation, whilst also wanting a slow death for the killer, he took her in his arms and they fled the bridge, to the sound of rageful screaming as they did so. Barely had their lifeboat pulled away from the tanker, along with several others containing what remained of the crew, before she slipped down beneath the waves behind them. With the German cruiser having left in pursuit of the convoy stragglers, there was now little left to indicate the violence that had occurred, save for patches of burning fuel here and there, and the occasional piece of smouldering flotsam. Several hours later, the crew of the Swedish vessel Sturholm selflessly stopped to rescue the survivors. Amidst the wounded and dying sailors, they paid little heed to a pale and ashen American teenager, gripping an ancient sword hidden beneath her blankets. And by the time they had returned to Liverpool, young Jessica's hair and clothing had already been altered by her new guardian to protect her identity. Whilst Owen Thomas was later sat relating his tale to the naval authorities, the girl was already on her way to a quiet village on the outskirts of Cardiff to start a new life. For the first few months after the event, she would find herself waking in terror, staring fixatedly at the floorboard under which she had hidden the centuries-old weapon. But in time, she learned to take comfort in the thought of its owner, still breathing but trapped forever in torment, deep underneath the waves, before she then fell back into a restful slumber.